The doors of the supermarket groaned as they slid open, letting in a blast of icy December air. Nate shivered, stepping into the harsh, fluorescent light. His breath clouded in front of him, even inside. The store felt wrong. The air carried a strange stillness, as if the world outside had stopped moving. He glanced around. A handful of tired shoppers wandered the aisles, their faces pale under the flickering lights. It was Christmas Eve, nearly midnight, and the shelves were half empty, picked clean by the holiday rush. But Nate wasn't here for holiday cheer. He was here for milk, a simple errand his roommate Kyle had insisted on before their annual tradition of marathoning old Christmas movies. As Nate reached for a basket, a voice interrupted. "You shouldn't be here this late," muttered the elderly cashier, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't look up, her gnarled fingers methodically arranging receipts. Nate forced a smile, just grabbing one thing. She didn't respond, her hands trembling slightly as she continued her task. The store felt larger than usual. Each aisle stretched impossibly long, the shelves looming over him. Nate grabbed the milk quickly, but hesitated by the freezer section, tempted by a pack of peppermint ice cream. That's when he noticed the man. At first, Nate thought he was just another shopper. The man stood at the far end of the aisle, facing away, his shoulders stiff. He wore a tattered coat that looked soaked, as if he'd walked through a blizzard. Nate felt a chill. The man wasn't moving. He just stood there, unnaturally still, his breath not visible in the cold air. "Hey, you good?" Nate called, forcing a casual tone. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly tilted his head, an almost imperceptible motion, as though he had heard Nate but chose not to acknowledge him. A faint, wet scraping sound echoed as he moved. Nate's stomach tightened. He backed away, the milk and ice cream forgotten, and hurried toward the checkout line. The cashier was gone. Nate's heart raced as he scanned the store for any staff. The fluorescent lights flickered above him, casting unsettling shadows across the tiled floor. He reached the self-checkout machines and swiped his items through quickly, his hands trembling. The receipt printed with a sharp click, but when Nate looked down, it wasn't his receipt. The paper was blank, save for one word scrawled in jagged red ink. The workouts were on a shelf. A chill ran down his spine. He spun around, clutching his bag tightly. The store was empty. The shoppers, the strange man, the cashier, all gone. Only silence remained, broken by the faint hum of the light. Nate bolted for the exit. As he pushed through the doors, the icy wind hit him like a wall. The streets outside were unnaturally quiet, even for Christmas Eve. The snow beneath his boots crunched loudly, almost deafening in the oppressive silence. Halfway home, Nate began to notice the footsteps. They were faint at first, crunching softly behind him. He stopped, turning to look. But the street was empty. Only fresh snow stretched out under the dim glow of the streetlights. He started walking again, faster this time, his breath coming in sharp bursts. The footsteps returned, heavier now, dragging slightly, as though whatever was following him was struggling to keep up. He turned again. This time, there were tracks. They weren't human. Long, deep grooves in the snow, as if something massive and clawed was crawling after him. Nate broke into a run, his boots slipping on the icy pavement. The footsteps quickened, keeping pace. He didn't dare look back again. By the time Nate reached his apartment building, his lungs burned and his legs felt like lead. He fumbled with his keys, throwing frantic glances over his shoulder. The tracks were still there, etched deep into the snow, stopping just a few feet from the building's entrance. Inside, the warm air felt suffocating. He slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against the frame as he tried to catch his breath. The silence inside was almost worse than the noise outside. "Kyle?" he called out, his voice shaky. No response. Nate stepped into the living room. The lights were off, the glow of the television casting flickering shadows on the walls. The Christmas tree was toppled over, its ornaments shattered across the floor. And there, in the middle of the room, was a single wet footprint. Not a boot print, but something far larger, with elongated toes and deep claw marks. Christmas Eve was supposed to be magical. For Sean Mitchell, it was anything but. A sudden craving for hot cocoa sent him trudging through the store to the only store still open, Martingale's Market, a quaint, family-run convenience store nestled at the edge of their small, sleepy town. The clock was nearing 11 p.m., and the store's old neon sign flickered weakly against the icy wind. Sean tightened his scarf and pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed loudly. The store felt emptier than usual, even though a couple of shoppers wandered the aisles. Something about the air inside was unnerving. Too quiet, too still. The clerk behind the counter, a wiry man with a balding head, gave Sean a fleeting glance. "Close in 10 minutes, he muttered. Sean nodded, grabbing a basket. He didn't need much, just some cocoa, marshmallows, and maybe a snack or two. Oh. Building tension, the stranger in aisle 4. As Sean turned into the snacks aisle, he felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. A woman stood a few feet away, her back turned. She wore a long coat, its hem brushing the floor. Something about her was off. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical as she picked up a can of soup, inspected it, and then placed it back on the shelf. John shrugged it off, assuming she was just another tired shopper. But when he moved to the next aisle, she appeared there too, standing eerily still at the far end, her face obscured by the shadow of her hood. "Excuse me," he said, trying to step around her. She didn't respond. Her head turned slightly, just enough for Sean to glimpse pale, sallow skin and lifeless eyes that didn't quite focus on him. He stumbled back, muttering an apology, and hurried to the counter. The clerk looked up, his face pale. "You ready to check out?" Yeah," Sean said, his voice tight. "Who's that woman?" The clerk blinked, confused. "What woman?" Sean turned to point her out, but the aisle was empty. The last of the other shoppers had left, and Sean suddenly realized he was alone in the store with the clerk. "I just saw," he began, but the clerk cut him off. "We're closing." His tone was sharper now, more urgent. "You need to leave." Sean frowned but complied, grabbing his bag of items. The sense of unease grew as he stepped outside into the frigid night. The walk home should have been uneventful, but Sean couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. He turned back once, twice, 3 times, but the empty streets stretched behind him, bathed in the dim orange glow of the streetlights. That's when he saw them, footprints in the snow. They appeared about 10 feet behind him, one after another, as if some invisible force was taking deliberate, measured steps. His breath quickened. He walked faster. The prints kept pace. He turned on the TV for background noise, flipping aimlessly through channels. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw a movement, a flicker of motion outside his window. His heart sank. His apartment was on the 3rd floor. He approached the window cautiously, peeking through the curtain. A face stared back at him, pale, hollow-eyed, and impossibly still. Sean stumbled backward with a shout, but when he looked again, the face was gone, leaving only a faint smear of condensation on the glass. Sean spent the rest of the night with every light in the apartment on, clutching a kitchen knife. He didn't sleep. By morning, he finally worked up the nerve to step outside. The street was bustling with Christmas cheer, the events of the night before seeming like a fever dream. But as he reached for his car door, he froze. There, in the snow, were footprints. They circled his car, stopping just at his driver's side door. And in the center of his windshield, scrawled in frost, were 2 words. See you. John's breath hitched, and he turned wildly, scanning the street. The woman from the store stood across the road, staring at him with those same lifeless eyes. Slowly, she raised a hand pointing toward him and smiled. That was the last time anyone saw Sean Mitchell. His apartment was found untouched, his Christmas decorations still twinkling cheerfully. The only clue to his disappearance? A trail of footprints leading away from his building, vanishing into the snowy woods. The snow was thick, silent, and swallowed the sound of footsteps in the dead of night. Leah stood at the foot of her childhood home, the one she had left behind years ago. A small flicker of light from the upstairs window illuminated the otherwise dark, empty street. It called to her, beckoning her back, though every instinct screamed against it. She had never planned to return. Yet, when her estranged mother sent the letter, the one that arrived days before Christmas, it had pulled her back like a dark gravity. The words in the letter were simple. Come home. It's time to face the past. Leah hesitated. She thought of her mother, long lost in some kind of dementia, trapped in a world that wasn't real anymore. But this wasn't the past she was worried about. It was the night that still haunted her dreams, the night she left, and the things she left behind. Inside, the house was cold, far colder than the winter chill outside. Leah pushed open the door with a reluctant shove, the familiar scent of dust and decay hitting her immediately. She didn't even need to turn on the lights. She could feel it. This place, as old as it was, hadn't changed. It was as if the house itself had frozen in time, a snapshot of all the moments she'd tried to bury. Her footsteps echoed through the hall as she moved past the family portraits, her father's face twisted into a permanent frown, her mother's eyes hollow, as if they knew something she didn't. They had known. And Leah hadn't been able to ask. She reached the staircase. From the top came a faint sound, a low creak, as if something, or someone, was waiting. She forced herself to climb, subjecting herself to a painful, slow-down climb into the new building, and as the daylight dimmed, at the top she found her mother's room. It looked as if no one had been inside for years, save for the things left behind: a half-finished cup of tea, a chair turned at an odd angle. But the most jarring thing was the diary on the floor, open to a page that read, "Tonight will be the night she comes back." Leah felt a chill creep up her spine. She couldn't explain it. It was just a diary, a collection of fleeting thoughts, but this entry seemed different. It seemed prophetic. Her mother was in bed, her frail body barely covered by a thin sheet, the room around her dark but for the soft light of the fireplace. The bed had been untouched in months, but her mother sat upright, her back arched at an unnatural angle, her eyes wide open, unblinking. "Mom?" Leah whispered, stepping into the room. Her mother's lips curled into an unsettling smile. "You've come back." Leah's heart hammered. "What do you mean?" You should have never left," her mother croaked. "They've been waiting for you." Leah froze, feeling the air grow heavy, oppressive. The words hung in the air like a curse, an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She turned to the window, catching a glimpse of something moving in the snow outside. Too fast, too strange. It was gone before she could comprehend it. The floorboards groaned behind her, and when she turned back, her mother was standing. There was no mistaking the change. Her eyes were no longer just vacant, they were filled with something else. Leah didn't have time to ask. Her mother lunged forward, her frail hands gripping Leah's shoulders with an iron strength. "Yeah, I suspect that they are not mere brains, but live and die." Leah's heart stopped. She shoved her mother away, stumbling back as her head collided with the wall. For a moment, everything went black. When Leah opened her eyes, the room was different. The warmth of the fire was gone. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows. And then she saw them. Up, a figure, cloaked in shadow, stood at the doorway, tall and impossibly still. It was not human, at least not entirely. Its face was a void, an endless abyss that seemed to suck the light out of the room. Leah felt the suffocating grip of fear, but something inside of her, something she didn't understand, forced her to stand. You're not real," she muttered, though she wasn't sure she believed it. "Maybe he was," she said, reaching for a purse and capturing her vial. But what did it matter? What was? What was it that mattered? The figure didn't speak, but Leah could hear its voice in her mind, like 1,000 whispers crowding her thoughts. "We were always real. You just didn't know it." She took a step back. "What do you want from me?" The figure reached up, its long, thin fingers brushing the edge of the doorframe. "It's not what we want, it's what you need," snapped the director. In that moment, everything became clear. The memories flooded back. The ritual her mother had tried to forget, the strange disappearance of her father, the inexplicable deaths that had plagued the town for years, and the figures that had followed her, from her childhood dreams to her waking nightmares. Leah realized the truth at once. This place, her family, her past, had been built on a lie. The house was not merely a home, it was a gateway, a prison. And the figures outside weren't waiting for her to come back. They were waiting for her to set them free. Her mind reeled. She couldn't escape this. She couldn't outrun the truth that had been buried for so long. Her mother's voice broke through the fog of her thoughts, whispering urgently, "You have to stop them. They'll come for everyone if you don't." Leah turned back to the figure, now standing in the center of the room. "How do I stop them?" The figure tilted its head, an unnerving gesture. "It's too late. The snow has already begun." As if on cue, the room filled with a biting cold. The wind howled louder, and the shadow figure stretched its arms, revealing 1,000 twisting, writhing faces beneath its hood. They all stared at her with eyes full of accusation. Leah had no choice but to act. She grabbed the diary from the floor, her fingers trembling. Without thinking, she threw it into the fire, watching as the pages burned away. But nothing happened. The figure stepped closer, the air growing colder with each movement. Leah's skin prickled, and in a final moment of clarity, she understood. It was never about stopping them. It was about joining them. She tried to speak, but only a croak escaped. Etta uttered a break. The figure reached out, its hand grazing her cheek. She felt herself surrender, her vision blurring as everything around her faded to white. "Please, be safe now." The next morning, the snow was still falling. Leah stood outside, her feet sinking into the drifts of untouched powder. She looked at the house behind her, the once familiar building now a distant memory. And yet, as she walked away, a faint whisper echoed in her mind. "We'll be waiting." It was only then that Leah realized she had never truly escaped. She was now one of them. The ones who waited for those brave enough to face the past. The ones who never left. The snow continued to fall, as silent as the darkness that waited for its next victim.